My purpose today is not to bestow jewels of wisdom and pearls of truth upon you. Instead, my purpose is to poke at and tickle your mind with strange ideas. If you do not disagree with at least one thing I say during this lecture, you're not paying attention. So, let's get rolling here. I'd like to begin by talking about two computers that I have owned. The first of these is a Mac IIx, which I purchased in 1988, and the second is an iMac that I bought in 2013. And I would like to compare the power of these two machines. Now, the first way to estimate power is by looking at the number of transistors in the CPU. The Mac IIx had 190,000 transistors on it. The iMac has 1 billion transistors. That means that the iMac is, what, 5,000 times more powerful, just in terms of its processing power. In terms of speed, the clock speed of the Mac IIx was 30 megahertz, and the iMac runs at 2.6 gigahertz. That's 87 times faster. RAM. The amount of memory the Mac IIx came with was 4 megabytes. Wow. And the iMac comes with 8 gigabytes. That's 2,000 times as much memory. And finally, in terms of overall computing performance, you had to measure the information content of the screen. These are the two screens from the two computers at the same scale. You can see the Mac IIx, and it was only 8 bits deep, whereas the iMac is 24 bits deep. So the iMac screen is 350 times more communicative than the Mac IIx. So a rough way of estimating the total power is to multiply these numbers together. And when we do, we get a final product that the iMac is 30 billion times more powerful than the Mac IIx. Now, actually, that should come as no surprise, but it's still, wow, 30 billion times more powerful. Isn't that impressive? Okay, now let's talk about software. Here's a very popular game from 1988, Ultima 5, and a screenshot from it. You can see the screen didn't look that good, but, that's what they could do. Here's a popular game from 2013, BioShock Infinite. Now, obviously, we all know BioShock Infinite is going to be a lot better than Ultima 5. But how much better do you think it is? 10 times? Sure. 100 times? Okay. 1,000 times? Well, maybe. But I'll give you 1,000,000 times better. I'm willing to concede that BioShock Infinite is 1,000,000 times better than Ultima 5. Now, seriously, if it really were that much better, why, in playing it, you'd be having so much fun, it would kill you. So, but let's just say 1,000,000 times better. That's still, compared to the computer, terrible. The computer is 30 billion times more powerful, but the software is only 1,000,000 times better. There's a problem here. We can see it even better when we look at word processors like Microsoft Word or on the Apple Pages. Now, both of these programs started off more than 30 years ago. That is, the very first versions came out in the mid-1980s. And I think they've been big products, important products, and so they've had lots and lots of people working on them. In fact, I think it's safe to say that they've had hundreds of people, programmers, working on these two products. So here are two products that have had hundreds of programmers working on them for 30 years. Think how good those products must be. I mean, after that much work put into them, they should be perfect. Is there anybody here who's willing to agree that these two programs, either of these, are perfect?
Yes.
Because now that's the problem. How can it be that after 30 years, we still haven't attained perfection? This is a general problem with all software. And so I'd like to point out that software people, we really deserve to be ashamed of our performance because we're just not doing a good job. In general, I think it's safe to say, software sucks. They're just, I mean, there is very little software that I can look at and say, yeah, he really got it with that one. Why does software suck? How have we failed? Well, I claim that the problem is that we don't really understand what a computer is. And so I'd like to explain that by talking about something I call the great dichotomy between object and process. Now, the simple way to think of this is to ask, what is reality? And you can answer that question by saying, reality is a collection of objects. Or you could answer it by saying, reality is a system of processes. Now, this basic dichotomy shows up over and over in every field of human inquiry. For example, in physics, the two main things we have in physics are particles and waves. Particles are objects. Waves are processes. In economics, the two basic components of every economy are goods and services. Goods are objects. Services are processes. In computers, what makes a program? Data plus algorithms. Data is objects. Algorithms are processes. In linguistics, the two fundamental types of word in every language are nouns and verbs. Nouns describe objects. Verbs describe processes. In mathematics, we have numbers and operators. Even military science. Two basic aspects of military science are assets and operations. Assets are things like guns, tanks, and planes. They're objects. Operations are how you maneuver them around on the battlefield. That's a process. So over and over and over again, we see this same basic idea. So reality is really sort of like a yin-yang thing with object and process. But the thing is, the separation between object and process is not black and white. They blend together in a gray area in between. For example, in physics, at the quantum mechanical level, when you look at very tiny scales, it's impossible to tell particles apart from waves. If you look at an electron as if it were a particle, it looks like a particle. But if you look at the same electron as if it were a wave, it acts like a wave. So is it particle or is it wave? Well, hard to say. It's even more obvious in economics. When you go into McDonald's and you purchase a Big Mac, what are you actually paying for? Are you buying 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, pickle, onion on a sesame seed bun? Or are you buying the services of the people who take your money and the people who cook the food and the people who give you the food and the truck driver who drives the food to the restaurant? Are you paying for a good or for services? Well, both, I suppose. So when we apply this idea to computers, we start off by asking, what is a computer? And when you ask most people that question, they will point to the monitor and say, there's the computer. And we all laugh. They're so stupid. That's not the computer. This is the computer. Well, actually, if we want to be technically correct, this is the computer. This is the heart and soul of every computer, the CPU, or the central processing unit. The heart and soul of computing is processing, not data. And this is where we've gone wrong. I took 6 I went through my computer and found 6 games. And I broke into the file structure to get a rough idea of how much of each game was data and how much was code. Now, I actually couldn't get a good measure of code. I ended up getting an overestimate. But this game, for example, had 26 megabytes of data and only 2.2 megabytes of code. This one had 1,500 megabytes of data and only 2.1 megabytes of code. 1820 versus 3.4, 81 versus 2.3, 26 versus 2.1, 2150 versus 36. When you add all these numbers together, you get 5,727 megabytes of data and only 48 megabytes of code. That's the problem. That's the mistake we're making. We're thinking too much in terms of data and not enough in terms of process. If reality is a yin and a yang of object and process, then the reality of software should be a yin and yang of data and algorithm, and in the real world, it looks more like this. Lots of data, very little algorithm. We are out of balance. If our software was a hamburger, then it would look something like this. If our software was a car, it would look something like this. Wow, it looks really great on the inside. But the engine is a squirrel cage. That's the problem. So our goal here is to think more and more in terms of process and less in terms of object. Well, that's going to be difficult because, you see, most of humanity is biased towards thinking in terms of objects, not processes. And there's a perfectly good reason why. Here's a demonstration, at least with the English language. If you have a computer, go through all sorts of English text, counting up how many words there are of each type, you'll find that of the 1,000 most frequently used words, fully 600 of them are nouns, pronouns, or the adjectives that describe them. Only 300 of those words are verbs or the adverbs that describe them. In other words, we have twice as many words to talk about data as we have to talk about process. That gives you an idea of how biased we are in our thinking. The reason for this is right here. The human visual system. This is a primary way we learn about the world, right? And the eye sees objects. The eye does not see processes. And there is our problem. You can't help but look at that image and see 4 objects. It's automatic. It's just built into your brain. So there's our problem, and your problem then is, how can you move your thinking from the data side over to the process side? How can you teach yourself to think more in terms of processes? Well, I have 3 suggestions for you. They won't completely solve the problem, but they will help you get there. First suggestion: when you inquire into reality, when you ask about the nature of things, never ask, who is that, or what is that? Those are object questions. Instead, always ask, how did that turn out that way? Or why does this thing look the way it is? Those are process questions, and they're what give you the answers that you really need to get. And what this requires is that you see reality not just with your eye, but with your mind. In other words, don't just sit here passively looking around at the world and say, oh gosh, look at all of that. You've got to reach out with your mind and delve into things and wonder, what's this? Gee, I wonder, can I rip it off? Does it? No, it doesn't taste good. You've got to reach into things to understand how they work. Let me give you an example here. When you look at a tree, what do you see? Most people see leaves, branches, a trunk, and bark. But when I look at a tree, I see nutrients dissolved in water underground, slowly seeping into the roots, and then slowly coming up through the cambium, out into the branches, into the leaves, where it's driven by sunlight and to react with carbon dioxide to make adenine triphosphate, which is the, which is the fundamental molecule that drives all of the biochemical processes taking place inside a cell. And so a tree, I see a tree as a system of processes, not a collection of things. But the only way I can perceive that is by applying my mind to what I perceive. Come on, guy. There you go. Here's another example. I have it right here. I have here a rock, and this is a brown rock. And here is a picture of the brown rock. And if I show it to most people, they will look and say, a brown rock. Oh. Well, if you look at this and think in terms of processes, one of the things you'll notice is along this edge here, you'll notice these odd little curved marks. They don't show up very well in this photograph, but they're much easier to see on the thing. Here's what conchoidal marks look like when they're really big and easy to see. So those are conchoidal marks, and knowing that, look again at the rock, and you can see a set of conchoidal marks right along the edge there. And if you're seeing the rock through your mind, you will immediately ask, how did those conchoidal marks get there? And then if you study rocks, what you'll learn is that, if the rock is just bouncing down a cliff or down a stream or whatever, that doesn't make conchoidal marks. And if an animal chews on it, that doesn't make conchoidal marks either. There's really only one way to make conchoidal marks, and that's to take another piece of rock with a sharp point and then hit it very hard at a steep angle like that. And when you do that, you get little chips breaking off, and you'll get these conchoidal marks left behind, and in the process, this edge will be made sharper. Because you see, this isn't just a brown rock. This is a flint tool. It was found in France. It's several 100,000 years old. That is, the person who made it did it a few 100,000 years ago. Do you see how, when you look at reality with your mind, you see so much more? Reality opens up for you, and you see a whole universe. That's why you need to think in terms of seeing with your mind. Second suggestion. Come on. Connection lost. What do you mean, connection lost? Deep. There we go. Algorithms. Okay, we know that programs are meant to be, are combinations of data and algorithms. Yeah, we're good here. And that means that the actual code inside the program will be, boy, you are unhappy, will be composed of binary digits for the data and formulae for the algorithms. And here we come to one of the most important issues in designing software. Those formulae are expressed in a language called and you thought game design was going to be fun. Yep, that's the problem. Mathematics. I hate math. Everybody hates. Is there anybody in this room who likes math? I'm sorry, sir. There are people who can help you. So, I mean, really, math, you don't need to panic here. Math does to the human body to the human mind what yoga does to the body. to do math, you had to twist your mind around in all sorts of weird, crazy ways. And it's hard. It's uncomfortable. It is no fun at all. But if you're going to be a designer, you've got to take your medicine here. You've got to learn how to use math. And when I say use math, I don't mean partial differential equations, group theory, tensors, vectors, matrices, integral calculus, or any of that stuff. I'm just talking algebra. Except when I say algebra, I don't mean pass a course in algebra or take a test and get through. I mean live it and breathe it so well that you can create with it. That means you have to really know what algebra means. And the only way to do that is with a lot of practice. Okay, third suggestion. You know how I was saying that, you have to see with your mind? Well, I mean, how did I know that those conchoidal marks are only made with the sharp stroke? Well, you do that by reading about things. Now, here's a book I strongly recommend. This is a great book. It's loads of fun. This guy just explains how everything works. Transistors, jet engines, airplanes, plumbing. He just describes everything, and it's a delightful book. It's lots of fun. I strongly encourage you to read this book. But really, what you want to learn about are systems, because if you're going to learn how to design systems of processes, you need to expose yourself to all kinds of different systems of processes. And if you learn a lot of different ones, you'll start seeing the universal concepts that apply. For example, a good place to start is physics. Yeah, I know, physics. I have a master's degree in it, and I do not get a master's degree in physics, but it would be a good idea to learn the basic concepts of physics, because at the simplest level, physics describes the simplest possible processes in clean mathematical terms, and that's a useful idea to get. Electronics is another one, Ohm's law, RC constants, this kind of stuff. This is a very useful system, and the fun thing about it is you can use what you learn to build fun circuits. For example, this thing here, Arduino, this is really neat. Boy, this is so much fun. It's a computer that you can plug little wires into, and the wires can go to lights and motors and speakers, and you can have sensors coming in with temperature and light and all sorts of different things. And you can control things and make fun toys. Like this is a tank I'm building, and the Arduino in it provides the navigational controls, so it'll be able to maneuver all around my land. And every now and then, it'll do this at night, and every now and then it'll take a real bright flash, flash! And the purpose is to chase away the animals, the wild animals who aren't supposed to be on my land. So, anyway, here's another system of processes, evolution. This is really neat. Evolution, I remember reading about evolution and every now and then just giggling. That's really funny how that works. Because there are so many really clever things in evolution that are terribly impressive. If you'd like to get started with evolution, I recommend this author here, Stephen Jay Gould, for two reasons. First, he's a wonderful writer, and you just learn a lot about good writing by reading him. And second, he explains a lot of evolutionary concepts in a very clear manner. These are not textbooks at all. They're just lots and lots of different stories that in some way are about evolution or science. And he's fun to read, and you learn a lot. Another area to study is war, the military history. Because warfare decides the fates of so many societies, there is no other field that has gotten more intensive intellectual effort than warfare. I mean, people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to kill each other better. Now, there is the minor problem that war is ugly and terrible and so forth. But if you can get past that, if you can look at war with cold blood and just think in terms of war as a system, you start realizing there are a lot of very clever ideas built into military science. Most of the books on war, though, are really kind of boring because they're just, oh boy, Joe the soldier went out, blah, 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 and he killed a bunch of people, and then blah, 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 blah. You're not going to learn anything from that crap. But there are some scholars. John Keegan is probably the best military historian of the 20th century, and this book is about warfare at the most intellectual level possible. Very, very good book. Come on, mouse. Hello, mouse. Whatever. Law. Law is a system of processes for regulating the behavior of people. People are very complicated, and they do all sorts of strange things. So law has to be complicated to regulate all those different behaviors. Studying how law works is itself very interesting. There are three basic legal systems that we know a lot about. The first is the Roman legal system, which is the basis for most law in Europe. There's the English legal system, which is the basis for law in England and America. And they're very different legal systems. And then finally, there's the Chinese legal system, which is completely different, where the Western legal systems try to be very logical and analyze. A Chinese scholar once said, "You Westerners, your idea of law is crazy. The judge should have all the freedom he needs to make good judgments, and so you shouldn't write everything down so narrowly. The judge should just use his common sense." Well, that's one way of thinking about it. Another thing, the human brain is the most complicated system known to humanity. I mean, it is very, very complicated. We really don't know a great deal about how the brain works, but what we have learned is very interesting. Even at the simplest level of neurophysiology, the way neurons work and how they connect to each other, that's a very interesting system all by itself without even thinking about the higher levels of brain function. And while we're at it, let's talk about physiology in general, the way all those chemicals move around in the body and trigger various organs to do various things. That's a really interesting system. Now, at this point, you are probably asking, why should I bother? I mean, this is a lot of work, and I can tell you it is. I'm 66 years old. I've been reading this stuff since I was a kid, and I am still learning more stuff every day. So you'll probably, if you start working at it really hard right now, you will probably figure most of it out at about the time you retire. Nevertheless, I recommend that you do this for a reason that is far more important than merely designing good software. Let's talk about how thinking developed inside the human brain. The original structure, and in fact the structure in all human brains, the basic structure in all human brains, and in fact in all brains, is a neural net with all the neurons interconnected in very complicated ways. This is a nice, neat geometric diagram, but the real thing looks like spaghetti. But in large brains like the human brain, the brain is divided up into specialized chunks. That is, the brain isn't a general purpose computer. It's not like you're born with an operating system and then your parents start putting apps into your brain, and then you go to school and they start putting more and more apps in until, when you graduate, you've got all the apps you need. No, that's not at all how the brain works. The brain has specialized modules. It's best to think of the brain as like a Swiss Army knife with a special blade for whatever particular type of problem comes along. And there are a lot of different mental modules, but four of the biggest and most important are first, the visual spatial module. This is what allows you to see the world, but it also allows you to see it in 3D. Your eyes don't produce 3D. You've got to actually do a lot of computations to think in 3D. They allow you to figure out the shape of objects just from the shading of their edges. They allow you to visualize, you know, if I want to get from here to there, well, I'm going to need to walk sideways for a while and then around here and like that. Figuring out paths, a visualization, or the ability to look at this and visualize what it's like in your mind so that you can do better things with it. Next interesting module, boy, you are really, there. Next interesting module is the nature module. This is the module that tells you if you put your hand in the fire, you will burn your fingers. Or if you eat the green berries, you'll get sick, but if you wait until they turn blue, then they'll taste good. Another module is the social reasoning module. That is what allows us to empathize with other people, but more important, to understand what's going on inside their heads so that you can anticipate their response. So you don't say things like, "Hey, Joe, my best buddy, hey, I slept with your wife last night." You know, you can anticipate behavior, and that affects a lot of things. Then lastly, there we go, is the language module, which obviously helps us speak to each other and so forth. So those are the basic four of the most important mental modules. Now, the way they work in any brain, animal, human, whatever, basic idea is you get sensory information all coming in, and then each of the modules looks at it, and the right one will jump up and down and say, "Hey, that's mine, I know how to do that," and it'll take over. And then something else will come in, and another module says, "That's my department, I'll take it." And so each module handles the problem that it is meant to handle. That's the way that, and it's a very efficient system if you think about it. The best thing about it is, if something happens and you don't have a lot of time to think, it gives you an answer very quickly. However, language changed everything. Because if you're going to talk about something, you have to know about it. If your language module is going to talk about your nature module, if you want to warn somebody, "Hey, don't eat those green berries," then the language module has to be connected to the nature module. And so as language became more and more powerful in the human mind, it established stronger and stronger connections with all of the other modules. And that ended up, language sort of became the central focus of an awful lot of thinking inside the human brain. And that in turn, this is where it got really interesting, because if language is connected to all the modules, then all the modules are indirectly connected to each other through the language module. That allowed these modules to start interacting with each other. And that led to all sorts of wonderful things happening. Now, these interactions did not take place all at once. They were spread over tens of thousands of years, but let's talk about some of them. When the visual spatial module began interacting with the social module, think about that for a second. We're thinking in terms of images, and we're thinking in terms of social things. What does that produce? The visual arts. Pictures of things that are socially significant. Or when the social module began interacting with the language module, what does that mean? We're going to talk about social relationships. Well, that's storytelling, because storytelling is fundamentally about how people get along with each other. Let's see, the next one here was, this one's really good. The interaction between social module and nature module. Think about that. We've got nature over here, and we're wondering, why did lightning strike that tree? Or why did we have plenty of rain last year, but this year we have a drought? Well, the social module has one answer to everything. There's somebody whom we have to somehow convinced to do the right thing for us. And in this case, that somebody is a very powerful person, obviously, because they're the guys who make, he's the guy who makes the drought or the rain or whatever. So all we got to do is kiss up to the really this powerful rain person. And this person is what we now call a god, and that's how religion got started. Basically, the idea was, the way I get ahead in the world is I go to each person and I give him what he wants, and that will convince him to do good things for me. So I got to do good things for this God, but I've never actually been able to talk to him or ask him what he wants. So all I know, though, is that if it hurts me, it must be a really good gift. So I want to give him things that really hurt, except I don't want him to hurt me. So let's sacrifice a virgin to the god. And that way, you know, the god will be really happy. And so that's one of the things that got religion started. Now let's talk about the interaction between language and the visual spatial module. That should be easy enough to see. It produces writing. Writing is simply visual language. And then finally, the interaction between language and nature, that's a little tricky. Language is inherently sequential. That is, you think of one word, the next word, the next word, the next word, and so forth. And so when language interacted with nature, we thought in terms of this happens, then that happens, then this, then that. And that is what ultimately led to science. So you can see the interactions between the modules had all sorts of interesting effects. And that led to a creative explosion. This started maybe 50,000 years ago, and we saw just a tremendous change in human behavior. We saw the cave paintings starting to appear about this time. The stone tool kits, the types of stone tools that people use, they'd always had a few basic tools that everybody made. But starting about 50,000 years ago, we started to see all sorts of really strange tools, very highly specialized. We also started to see very specialized tools made out of wood or bone or horn, especially needles, which they then used to make clothing, which is really handy if you're embarrassed about your body. They also made nets to capture birds and fish with. And then the biggest discovery, they figured out that they could grow their own food. If you plant the seeds, then the stuff will grow and you can harvest it and you'll have lots of food. That's what led to farming and the agricultural revolution. And the way that worked was that you had a whole bunch of farms, and it was too easy for some bad people to come along and, you know, with their swords kill the farmers and take the grain. And so the thugs who were stealing all the grain decided to get organized, and they formed soldiers with the head thug being the king. And so it was, all cities were basically just a bunch of thugs in the center forcing the farmers to give them some of their grain. But there was a flaw in their plan, and that involved taxes. The tax collector goes out with his thug friend and goes to the farmer and says, all right, you will pay 10 bushels of grain. And the farmer, okay, and puts the 10 bushels of grain into the wagon, and then the guy drives the wagon over to the palace, and they unload 9 bushels of grain. Why? Because the guy who drives the wagon stopped along the way and he hid 1 bushel for himself. And there was no way they could stop that. If they had a soldier go along with the wagon driver would simply split the deal with the soldier. And so they'd still get away with it. And they just couldn't figure out a way to stop this until they invented writing. The idea was, the tax collector says, all right, this farmer here is giving 10 bushels, and then he has a piece of soft clay, and he makes marks that mean 10 bushels, and then he puts his special little seal onto it, gives that to the driver, and when the driver gets to the palace, the guy at the palace takes the thing and says, all right, I better see 10 bushels here, or you're in trouble. So writing was invented, isn't this ironic? Writing was invented to make taxes work better. So, but I'm taking a lot of big jumps here. The next step in a long process was the Greeks. They used writing, but they used it for a completely different purpose. They were a mercantile society, and they had people trading all over the Mediterranean. And the problem was, if you wanted to be powerful, you didn't turn into a thug. If you went to people and said, give me all your stuff, they'd just get in their ships and sail away, and that was that. So the way to get ahead in the world was to be richer, and the way to do that was to get better deals. And the way to do that was to have a cousin in this city way over here who writes you letters saying, oh wow, the price of wine right now is great, send more wine. And then you have a nephew over there who says, no, olive oil is what we need here. And that, of course, required writing. But more important, you had to think it through. You had to collect all this information from different people and analyze it and rationally conclude. And if you just went with your feelings, you might be wrong, you go broke. The only way you could get ahead was to be rational. The Greeks invented rationalism. And that, in turn, reached its culmination with this man, Socrates. He took rationalism to its absolute extreme. He would cook up these long arguments saying, you know, what color do you think the sky is? And the guy would say, well, I don't know, I think it's blue. And then Socrates would start off on this long argument saying, well, what do you mean by blue? And does blue look like this? And what about green? Blah, 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 blah. And at the end of this argument, he would have proven that the sky is actually red. And the guy says, well, gee, Socrates, that's really neat. And that's how Socrates did all of this stuff. He had these long arguments. But Socrates refused to write anything down because he felt that the role of teaching is not to just dump knowledge onto people. He felt that the role of teaching, you had to interact with them. You had to elicit the truth from inside the person by asking them a series of questions. And that the only way people really understand something is if they already know it, but they don't realize they know it yet. And so that's what Socrates did. He refused to write anything down, but eventually, just to get peace of mind, the Athenians had to kill him. And his student, Plato, thought, we can't let all this wisdom just vanish. So Plato wrote everything down. Everything that Socrates said, Plato wrote down to preserve for history, which was very nice. And then Plato had a student named Aristotle. And of course, Plato made Aristotle read all of Socrates' stuff. And Aristotle made a huge discovery. And that was, he's reading through, flip, flip. And then he'd stop and say, wait a minute. Right here, Socrates says this, but way back here, he says something completely different. In fact, this contradicts what he said there. And that was a huge discovery because what it meant is that writing is a navigational tool for thinking. You can use writing to check your work and keep going back and checking to make sure everything is consistent. And in the end, you can be sure that your final result is solid. And that was his big discovery, and he boiled it all down into a very simple concept called the syllogism, which you've seen many, many times before. And that led to a completely new way of thinking, sequential thinking, where you chain syllogisms together in a sequence, and if you follow the rules for how syllogisms work, you can be absolutely certain that no matter how long your chain is, the end result will be right. And that was really exciting. We could actually know things for sure. Unfortunately, and see, when you compare these two styles of thinking, people still continue to do mostly pattern thinking because sequential thinking is hard. And Aristotle was at least 1,000 years ahead of his time. And so for the next 1,500 years, almost nothing happened until this guy came along, San Thomas Aquino, and he had this really neat idea. He said, we theologians, We're always arguing about everything, and the arguments go round and round and up and down, and we never actually come to any conclusions. We just argue, and eventually we get bad enough, we start killing each other. He said, I've got a better idea. What if we take this Aristotle stuff with logic and we use that in theology? And that way we can prove what's right and what's wrong, and we won't have to argue anymore. And he wrote everything down in a big book called the Summa Theologica, which in turn, at first everybody said, you're crazy, but after about 50 years, people came around, and Aristotle became dogma. Aristotle is right. And so a whole new school of thought was founded called scholasticism. And for 300 years, Christian scholars did all sorts of stuff, trying to use logic in religion. It didn't work in the end, and after 300 years, they gave up on it. But in the meantime, they used these Aristotelian techniques to explore everything they could. And one of the things they looked into was how a rock flies through the air. And Aristotle had a really stupid way of explaining it that didn't work, but this guy and three of his friends, this is Richard of Wallingford, together, the four of them were called the Oxford calculators. They made a huge addition to it. They added numbers to the logic. They were figuring out, if it goes this far over and that high up, then we got these numbers here, but then a little later it goes this far and that high, and they used numbers to figure out how the rock flies through the air, and so they added numerical thinking to logic. And that was a huge transition. It changed everything. It led to Copernicus, and then Galileo, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, and so forth. And the next big step, I'm cutting out a lot of stuff here. The next big step was taken by this guy here, Isaac Newton. His big contribution was to add not just numbers, but mathematics to logic. He combined math with logic, and that is what led to the scientific revolution. And that in turn led to the Industrial Revolution, which led to modern technology. So let me summarize this story for you. We have writing leading to Aristotle creating logic, which in turn San Tommaso Aquino used in theology, which led to the Oxford calculators adding numbers to the logic, which led to Isaac Newton adding mathematics to the logic, which led to the Industrial Revolution, which led to modern technology. To make it even shorter, writing led to technology. Now, writing is a way of communicating, a way of putting your ideas down on paper. But you see, computers have another kind of writing. It's called programming. And it's a very different kind of writing. And it is fundamentally different from all the other kinds of writing because of this word right here, if. This, you don't do this with regular writing, but with if, the idea of branching, everything changes. Because instead of having a single line of thought, you end up with a tree of possibilities. Instead of, in very special and narrow cases, being able to calculate exactly what the right answer is, instead of that, you calculate all the answers that could be true. And a lot more of the world works this way than can be solved with logic. So what we have here is a completely new way of thinking. It took 5,000 years to go from writing to logic and sequential thinking. We are right now at the beginning of a new style of thinking that I call subjunctive thinking. And you are the people at the leading edge of this. You are the people who will make this happen. Good luck.